When you think of John Talbot, and many of you knew him personally because he hasn't left us all that long ago, you can think of patriot, you can think of member of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation, you can think of citizen. Above all, you can think of somebody who was born, bred, schooled, you name it, in Centerville, Iowa. He was born here, he went to school here, he graduated out of Centerville High School in 1937. He then became enrolled in the Centerville Junior College. John knew from probably birth on that he wanted to be a pilot. He wasn't any ordinary pilot. This man was a brilliant pilot. So while he was at Centerville Junior College, out at Centerville Airport, he got his civilian pilot's license. He was given the grade of Class 1A. He now decided that he wanted to become a naval air pilot. He was now about 20 years old. He applied to the Naval Air Company that was then in Des Moines. He took extensive tests, he took examinations, he took them in Des Moines, he took them in Fairfax, Virginia, he took them in Kansas City, and he didn't just do well, he passed every single test with 100% accuracy. And while he was at Centerville Junior College, he took on a double role of taking on extra trigonometry and calculus classes so that he would understand everything about the aircraft and flying. As soon as he had graduated from Fairfax in Virginia, he now applies to Pensacola. Every class he was in which he made these amazing scores, Johnny was usually the youngest member of the class, and he was always the only one from the state of Iowa. He went to Pensacola, received his training, and he became 21 years old on April the 7th, 1941. What a time. By the end of the year, on December the 7th, 1941, was the day of infamy with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, in which Americans were totally taken aback, and I have to say somewhat unprepared. Don't worry, they'll correct it. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, immediately there was a call to the home front, and that is the most significant story about Centerville as well as the members of the greatest generation. Because these people in this community moved to collect every scrap of metal they could find, kids knocking on doors 16 times a day, demanding nickel and metal out of every household in the area. And all this was swept up across the country, sent to bases and to factories. Women left the town. One of my favorite stories is Mary Lodge from X-Line. She sent home a letter, and she had become a welder in a Seattle shipyard. And she said, when I was in Centerville, I was earning $2 a week as a housekeeper, and I'm now earning $60 a week. So women, too, are never going to look back. But back to Johnny. Johnny is placed aboard the USS Hornet. He is to fly an F-4F Grumman Wildcat aircraft. I have a dream that one day we could afford one of these aircrafts and hang it somewhere around Centerville, you know, because Joe Wilson flew in one of these as well. Anyway, for Johnny, he's flying this aircraft, and remember, because this is going to be significant in a few minutes, there's only 4 hours of gasoline aboard one of those little aircrafts, those Wildcat aircrafts. He's on the USS Hornet, and then a remarkable but suicide mission is going to occur. Jimmy Doolittle, you might have known his name, is determined to do to the people of Tokyo what had been done to the people of Pearl Harbor. He lines up 16 B-25s. Now these B-25s knew it was a suicide mission, every pilot aboard. They were going to fly one way. They could not have enough gasoline to come back. They flew towards Tokyo to drop bombs, and we now know, and if you ever want to know anything about the Second World War, read John Keegan's World War II, which is every detailed classic. What they did was fly, and we know now that the people of Tokyo had no idea what these bombs were dropping around or who was doing it, but the authorities in Japan did know, and they were frightened. So they determined that as soon as this mission was over, and Johnny Talbot was one of the escort missions. He couldn't go the whole way because of the 4 hours of gasoline that he had on his aircraft. But he escorted those B-25s of Jimmy Doolittle part way towards Tokyo. So now Johnny, back on board the USS Hornet, receives instructions that the Japanese are approaching for the famous Battle of Midway. Now, all the experts will tell you that the Battle of Midway was the turning point of the war in the Pacific. And look how long it had taken America to recover, with the full help of the people of the United States at home in communities like this. So what happened was, at the Battle of Midway, Johnny was to take off in his F-4F Wildcat aircraft. He was given instructions. He looked at the other pilots in their F-4F Wildcat aircraft. They all knew that the mission they'd been given meant they would run out of gasoline before they could get back. They still went. Hundreds of them. They took off, and we know that the Battle of Midway has been called a glorious battle because it was literally the turning point. Instead of America being on the defensive against the Japanese in their naval enterprises, now America was on the attack. We know that the Japanese, after the Battle of Midway, produced 4 extra aircraft carriers. America produced 14 within weeks, and they produced endless escort carriers and light carriers. If you add all the carriers up, America had produced 89. And that was largely, again, thanks to what was being done at home. What about Johnny? Well, he took off to his assignment, and he ran out of gasoline. A couple of people have said to Johnny, you was shot down. He looked at me and he said, no Japanese ever shot me down. I ran out of gasoline. He ran out of gasoline, ditched his aircraft in the Pacific Ocean, and now was a titanic battle for sheer survival of Johnny. He had 60 seconds to get out of the aircraft and to grab an inflatable rubber life raft. As his plane started to go down after 60 seconds, his foot was caught on an aerial. He fought to get his foot free, and he now turned to the rubber raft, and it would not inflate. He had to pump the air in with his mouth, at the same time trying to stay afloat, and he could only get half of it inflated because the other valve, a key section, was missing. Now on this half a life raft, he turns for his supplies to keep him alive. They had been pilfered. He had half a canteen of water, which is the equivalent of about a pint, and 1 bottle of malt tablets. This had to keep Johnny alive for 4 nights and 5 days. And what was the weather like? At night it was freezing cold, and in the ditching of the aircraft he'd lost half his clothes. He was freezing cold at night, told me he thought he'd die of cold. And then during the day the sun was so brutally hot that he becomes very quickly sunburned, covered with blisters, and of course increasingly dehydrated. If that wasn't enough, sharks surrounded the raft. He had a collapsible oar, and he would punch them on the nose, and that kept the rafts away. And the additional worry was he had no idea what had happened at the Battle of Midway. He didn't know if America had lost. He didn't know if anybody was out searching for him. And remember too, he's a tiny speck. on 200,000 square miles of sheer Pacific Ocean. He saw 4 aircraft flying above him. They didn't find him. Finally, almost at the point where Johnny had given up all hope, a PBY Catalina finds him, comes down, lands alongside him. They had to lift Johnny. He was too weak to get off the raft. They got him into the aircraft, and he said that pilot should have got a medal. He said he chucked everything overside. We were way overloaded. He picked up a couple of other people that were on rafts. He even dumped 1,200 gallons of gasoline. He made everybody take off their shoes. Everything was dumped into the ocean, and he said, right, I'm going to try. He said, the only way I can do it is straight up. And the PBY Catalina somehow got off that ocean, and it limped into Midway, and then Johnny was conducted to Pearl Harbor to a hospital. Now, the interesting detail about this is when Johnny arrived at Pearl Harbor Hospital, the man who would be a terrific Hollywood director by the name of John Ford was taking photographs, movie photographs. And that movie, Unknown, was shown at a newsreel at the Majestic. And Ronnie Swayze stood up and shouted, "That's Johnny Talbot!" And that's the first that his family or the people in the town knew that Johnny somehow or other survived. He did survive. He spent the rest of the war training pilots on 4 new aircraft carriers. And he was on board Bunker Hill, survived 2 kamikaze attacks. One of the kamikaze attacks, where Johnny had been standing just moments earlier, he'd moved away 30 feet and it hit right at the spot where he'd been standing. When the war was over, Johnny came home. He became a businessman, he became a conservation officer in eastern Iowa, and he became a partner with his father at Talbot Lumberyard here in town. Johnny was a passionate conservationist. Furthermore, he was part of that whole movement in this town to restore the Second Baptist Church, together with Royal Simmons and with Bob Green. Those 3 men helped rebuild. They did all the work practically themselves, rebuilding the Second Baptist Church. And that's when Bob Green, in those conversations, when they were doing that, began to find out the story. John was a shy man. And none of these men went around town telling you they were a national hero, even if they were. They didn't drive their expensive cars or anything. They just came in to meld with the population. And when I said to John, "You're a national hero, John." "No," he said. "The people left at home were the national heroes. Think what they were deprived of. Think how they pulled together. Think what they produced to support us all." When John died, Bob Green tried to get the Navy to have a flyover of this grave. The Navy were very interested, but they said they didn't have enough time to do this because they would have to have flown from Michigan right in here. But I'll never forget the funeral. The Navy sent 2 young men in completely white uniforms, so disciplined that as you watched that, you couldn't help but wanting to cry with pride for these 2 young men slowly lifting their arms and saluting. And one of them did say to me, "I'm so glad I knew the story of Johnny Talbot." The next man you're going to meet is also a member of the Greatest Generation. These men came back, they worked, they formed the most incredible economic giant of the United States that the world has ever known or could ever dream could exist. And they knew that the foxholes of Europe and the hellholes of Asia were equal opportunities. They came back to make sure that that was carried out in the United States as well. Johnny Talbot. Thank you.